It was a night few would forget. The storm rolled in with a fury that shook houses and rattled windows, filling the darkened streets with flashes of lightning and the booming echo of thunder. Rain poured from the sky in relentless sheets, pooling along the edges of the narrow road and sending pedestrians scurrying inside for shelter. But in the midst of this storm, one figure remained unmoved. It was Mick, a large, dark-furred dog with eyes that gleamed with a mix of loyalty and desperation as he stood guard beside an old, abandoned car. Mick wasn't just any stray. His sturdy, well-fed appearance and the deep intelligence in his eyes suggested he had a purpose, a duty known only to him. His coat was drenched, and his paws muddied from hours of standing in the pouring rain, but he held his position firmly, barking with a persistence that sliced through the noise of the storm. His low, almost mournful barks were not random, not aggressive, they were pleas, as if he were calling for someone to notice, to help. In the quiet neighborhood, Mick's barking hadn't gone unnoticed. People began peeking out of their windows, curious and slightly alarmed by the strange sight. Was this dog aggressive? Was he sick or lost? As the minutes passed, a few brave souls stepped outside, umbrella in hand, to get a closer look. Among them was Jacob, a retired soldier known for his calm, steady presence and his reputation for not backing away from difficult situations. Jacob was the first to approach Mick with a sense of purpose. He moved slowly, observing the dog's body language, noting the way Mick seemed to position himself protectively in front of the car's rear door. There was something fierce and determined about the dog's stance, something that reminded Jacob of the way soldiers would guard each other in battle. It wasn't just a dog looking for attention, it was a dog with a mission. Mick growled softly as Jacob drew near, his stance tensing, but Jacob didn't retreat. Instead, he crouched down, whispering calm words meant to reassure. "Easy there, buddy. I'm not here to hurt you," Jacob murmured, holding his hand out slowly. "What's going on? What are you trying to tell us?" But Mick wouldn't let him come any closer. The dog's deep growls escalated as Jacob extended his hand toward the car, and it was then that the gathering crowd understood, Mick wasn't guarding himself, he was guarding whatever was inside that car. The neighbors, curious yet wary, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some suggested calling animal control, while others simply watched, uncertain of how to proceed. Most of them had seen Mick around the neighborhood, always in the company of a young woman with kind eyes and a small child. But they hadn't seen her for days now, and no one had thought much of it, until tonight. As the minutes passed and the rain continued to pour, an elderly woman named Mrs. Martyr made her way toward the crowd, her frail frame hidden under a large raincoat. Mrs. Martyr was known for her gentle heart and her love for animals. She had a reputation for taking in stray cats and feeding the birds, and when she saw Mick, her heart immediately softened. "Give him some space, all of you," she called out, her voice surprisingly firm for someone her age. The crowd parted slightly, allowing her to approach. She spoke softly to Mick, her voice laced with kindness and understanding. "I know you're scared, boy. You're protecting something important, aren't you?" Mick's ears perked up slightly, as if he recognized that Mrs. Martyr was an ally, not a threat. She reached out a hand, not toward the car, but toward him, offering a gentle pat. Slowly, the dog relaxed, his growls quieting into a low whine as he allowed her to come closer. Mrs. Martyr turned to the crowd, her gaze serious. "This dog is not dangerous. He's protecting something in that car," she said. "But we can't just ignore this. Whatever's inside, it needs our help, and this boy here won't rest until we find out what's going on." Realizing that this situation required more than just the crowd's curiosity, Mrs. Martyr pulled out her phone and made a call to the local police department. She knew just the person to call, Officer Clark, a kind-hearted man with a particular talent for handling animals. She explained the situation, stressing the urgency in her voice, and assured the crowd that help was on the way. Minutes later, the sound of police sirens broke through the storm, and 2 patrol cars pulled up near the scene. Out stepped Officer Clark, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor and an easy smile that often put even the most nervous souls at ease. He assessed the situation quickly, taking in the soaked crowd, the anxious dog, and the silent, dark car. Approaching Mick slowly, Clark lowered himself to the dog's level, meeting Mick's intense gaze with his own. "Hey, boy," he said in a soothing voice. "I can see you're doing your job. You're looking after something in there, aren't you?" Mick seemed to recognize Clark's kindness, and for a moment, his intense gaze softened. Clark extended a hand cautiously, allowing Mick to sniff it. Gradually, Mick lowered his head, almost as if he were giving permission, and stepped back a few inches, his eyes still glued to the car door. Clark took a deep breath, steeling himself as he moved closer to the car's back seat. With a gentle pull, he opened the door, his eyes widening as he looked inside. In the dim light of his flashlight, he saw a fragile, unmoving figure, a tiny baby, bundled in layers of blankets, alone and silent in the back seat. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The crowd gasped in shock, and Mick whimpered softly, his eyes never leaving the baby. The quiet that fell over the scene was profound, broken only by the soft pattering of rain on the metal of the abandoned car and the faint hum of the police car's lights. Officer Clark looked over his shoulder, momentarily locking eyes with the gathered crowd. The shock and concern on their faces mirrored his own, but he quickly turned his attention back to the fragile child swaddled in blankets. 1,000 questions filled his mind. Who would leave a child alone in such a storm? And what was the connection between this baby and the fiercely loyal dog that had stood guard all night? Clark glanced at Mick, who watched him intently, as if urging him to act quickly. Mick's eyes were filled with a strange mix of desperation and hope, and Clark knew in that moment that this dog understood more than anyone might believe. Mick wasn't just a pet, he was a protector, a witness to something that had left an innocent child abandoned. Gently, Clark reached into the car and lifted the small bundle into his arms. The baby's face was pale, and his breathing faint, but there was a warmth to him that reassured Clark he was still alive. "Hang on, little one," Clark whispered softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. He cradled the baby close, shielding him from the cold as best as he could, and moved swiftly toward his patrol car, signaling to his partner to call for an ambulance. Mick trotted behind Clark, his steps hurried but careful, as if he were determined to stay as close to the baby as possible. It was as if he had taken an unspoken vow to stay by the child's side, no matter what. Clark watched the dog for a moment, marveling at the fierce loyalty and love he displayed. Mick's wet fur was plastered to his sides, and his eyes never left the bundle in Clark's arms. As the ambulance arrived, paramedics rushed to evaluate the baby's condition. They quickly wrapped him in a fresh, warm blanket, checking his pulse and ensuring he was stable before carefully placing him into the vehicle. Mick tried to jump in alongside them, barking anxiously when the doors closed, but Clark reached out to gently calm him. "It's all right, Mick," he murmured, kneeling down to the dog's level. "They're going to take care of him. You did an incredible job protecting him." Yet Mick wouldn't calm. He circled the ambulance, whining, his eyes wide with fear and longing. It was then that Clark realized the depth of Mick's attachment. This was not merely a dog guarding an unknown child. Mick had been tasked with watching over this baby, and he had no intention of leaving his duty unfinished. Sighing, Clark spoke to the paramedics, explaining the situation and requesting permission to allow Mick to ride along to the hospital. The paramedics exchanged a glance before nodding in agreement. They could see that the dog's loyalty was not something to be dismissed. it was as if he was part of a larger, untold story, one that they couldn't ignore. With a grateful bark, Mick hopped into the ambulance, settling himself protectively beside the infant's cot, his dark eyes unwavering as he resumed his silent vigil. At the hospital, the staff quickly took over, moving the baby to the intensive care unit to ensure he was stable. Mick trotted beside them, his eyes darting between each nurse and doctor, as if evaluating their intentions. The hospital staff was initially hesitant to allow the large dog to accompany them, but Clark, who had arrived shortly after in his patrol car, vouched for him, explaining Mick's unwavering dedication and his crucial role in protecting the child. As the night wore on, the story of Mick and the abandoned baby began to spread through the hospital, touching the hearts of everyone who heard it. Nurses and doctors paused in their routines to catch a glimpse of the dog who wouldn't leave the child's side. Mick had taken up residence just outside the baby's room, curling up on the floor and refusing to move, his watchful eyes fixed on the tiny form lying on the bed. Even the most seasoned staff members couldn't help but be moved by his dedication. During this time, Clark began making inquiries, hoping to uncover the identity of the child and any possible family members who might come forward. As he dug into recent reports, he came across a name that matched: Linda Moreno. She was a young mother who had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. According to the records, Linda had no immediate family and had been living on the streets for some time, struggling to care for her baby and herself. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Clark arranged a visit with Linda, who was also receiving treatment at a nearby ward in the hospital. He wanted to understand more about the bond between Mick and the baby, and why she had left her child in that abandoned car. With a heavy heart, he made his way to her room, carrying the weight of both his duty and his compassion. When Clark entered Linda's room, he found a frail, young woman lying on the hospital bed, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and relief. She looked up at him, her face softening as she saw the familiar uniform and kind expression. "Officer Clark, is it?" she asked weakly. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, sitting gently beside her. "I'm here because we found your baby, and Mick." Linda's eyes sparkled with tears, and she managed a faint smile. "Mick, he's been my only support. He's protected us when I couldn't. I didn't want to leave my baby, but I didn't have the strength." Her voice broke as she spoke, her words carrying a deep, aching regret. Clark nodded, listening intently. "Linda, I can see that Mick loves your son very much. He stayed with him through the storm, wouldn't let anyone near the car until help arrived. He's been an incredible guardian." A tear slipped down Linda's cheek as she gazed out the window, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't keep going, not like this. I knew Mick would stay with him if I couldn't. I thought it would only be for a short time until someone found them, but I couldn't bear the thought of my baby being alone." Clark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You did the best you could, Linda. Mick did too. Your son is safe, and we'll make sure he's cared for." Linda took a shaky breath, her eyes softening with a bittersweet gratitude. "Officer Clark, I don't have anyone else. No family, no friends. Please, promise me you'll make sure he's loved. That he won't be alone." The gravity of her request settled heavily in Clark's heart, but he met her gaze with a solemn determination. "I promise, Linda. I'll make sure he's looked after, and I'll make sure Mick is right there beside him." Linda's shoulders relaxed as if a great burden had lifted, and she nodded, her lips forming a faint smile. For the first time in a long time, she looked at peace. Back in the intensive care unit, Mick lay curled up on the floor beside the baby's bed, his eyes closed but his ears alert to every sound. He could sense the shift in the room, the gentle presence of the nurses and the doctors as they moved around him, checking on the baby's vitals and adjusting his blankets. Mick was exhausted, yet he would not rest until he knew the child was safe. Through the quiet halls of the hospital, the story of Mick's vigil spread, and those who passed by couldn't help but be moved by the sight of a dog so devoted, so unwavering in his loyalty. They knew they were witnessing something rare, a bond beyond words, a loyalty that defied logic. And in the silent watch of the night, Mick remained, the unspoken guardian of the child he had promised to protect. The following days passed with a quiet, tender rhythm. The baby, now stabilized and given the temporary name, Charlie, by the hospital staff, slowly regained strength. Mick, meanwhile, remained a constant presence by his side, curled up on the floor or resting his head on the edge of the bed, as if he could protect Charlie from anything and everything. Nurses brought food and water for Mick, and even the doctors, initially hesitant, found themselves comforted by the dog's steadfast presence. Clark kept his promise and visited both Linda and Charlie daily, updating Linda on her son's health and reassuring her that her baby was safe. Each day, Linda grew weaker, but she held on, finding comfort in knowing that Mick and Clark were watching over her child. Her greatest fear, that her baby would be alone in the world, had been quelled by the presence of these unexpected allies. On one particularly quiet afternoon, Clark visited Linda with Mick. He knew that time was running short for her, and he sensed she wanted one last chance to see her loyal companion. He brought Mick into her room, leading him gently to her bedside. As soon as Mick saw Linda, his eyes softened, and he let out a low, mournful whine, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. "Mick," Linda whispered, her voice barely a breath, but full of warmth and love. Mick stepped closer to her bed, laying his head on the mattress, his dark eyes full of the quiet understanding only a loyal companion could hold. Linda reached out with a trembling hand, resting it gently on his head, her fingers brushing through his damp fur. For a moment, her face softened, and a faint smile appeared. "You've been there for me, through everything," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "And now you're there for my son. Thank you, Mick. Thank you for keeping him safe." Clark stood quietly by, watching this intimate farewell between a woman and her devoted dog. The room felt heavy with emotion, yet there was a serene, almost sacred peace that filled the space as Linda whispered her final thanks and goodbyes. The love and loyalty between her and Mick were undeniable, a bond that had carried her through her darkest days and would continue to protect her son long after she was gone. Linda looked up at Clark, her gaze steady despite the weakness that had overtaken her. "Officer Clark. I don't have much time left, and I need to know that Charlie will be loved. That he'll have a family, a real family, even if I can't be there for him." Clark swallowed, feeling the weight of her request settle heavily in his chest. He had thought about this, knowing her time was short and understanding the responsibility that would fall on his shoulders. Looking into her eyes, he found his answer had been there all along. "Linda, I promise you," he said softly, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "My wife Hannah and I will take care of him. We'll raise him as our own. He'll have a home, love, and a family. And Mick will be there with him, just like you wanted." Tears filled Linda's eyes, and she managed a weak, grateful smile. She knew this promise came from a place of genuine compassion, not obligation. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace, knowing her son would be loved, not just by the community, but by people who truly cared. "Thank you, Officer Clark, thank you," she whispered, her voice fading as she released one last, relieved breath. Her eyes closed, and with that, Linda passed away peacefully, her face softened in a quiet smile. Clark stood by, holding Mick's collar gently as they both took a moment of silence, honoring the woman who had endured so much and loved so fiercely. Mick let out a low, heart-wrenching whine, pressing closer to the bed as if trying to reach Linda one last time. Clark patted Mick softly, comforting him, though he knew there were no words to truly console such a loyal soul. The days following Linda's passing were filled with both sorrow and new beginnings. Clark and his wife, Hannah, began the process of formally adopting Charlie, welcoming him into their lives and making arrangements to bring him home. For them, the decision felt natural, a way to honor Linda's memory and to give her son the life she had fought so hard to protect. When Charlie was finally released from the hospital, Clark brought him home with Mick by his side. Hannah was waiting by the door, her eyes filled with both anticipation and compassion as she held out her arms for the tiny boy. With gentle hands, she lifted him, pressing him close as she whispered soft words of comfort. "We're your family now, little one," she murmured, rocking him gently. "You're safe here." Mick watched closely, his eyes never leaving Charlie. It was as if he had accepted Hannah and Clark as part of his own pack, trusting them to care for the child he had guarded so fiercely. His loyalty had been unyielding, and it was clear to everyone that he saw his role in Charlie's life as a lifelong commitment. In the months that followed, the small family settled into a warm, happy rhythm. Mick adapted quickly to his new role in Clark and Hannah's household, becoming not only a guardian to Charlie but also a beloved family member. He would sit patiently by the crib while Charlie slept, his keen ears attuned to every sound, ready to bark softly if the child stirred. During the day, he would follow Hannah and Charlie around the house, his presence a constant reminder of the unbreakable bond he shared with the child. Clark and Hannah embraced Mick as an integral part of their family, admiring his loyalty and resilience. Their neighbors, too, quickly came to see Mick not just as a stray dog, but as a local hero, the loyal guardian who had protected a helpless child and stayed by his side through every trial. Whenever they walked down the street with Mick and Charlie, people would smile, nodding in respect and admiration for the dog who had shown such fierce dedication. One evening, as Clark watched Mick and Charlie playing together in the living room, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Mick, he realized, had not only saved Charlie's life but had given him and Hannah a new sense of purpose. In caring for Charlie and Mick, they had found a way to honor Linda's legacy, a legacy of resilience, love, and unwavering loyalty. As Clark and Hannah looked toward the future, they knew they would tell Charlie about his mother and the dog who had been his first protector. They would teach him about Linda's strength, her courage, and the sacrifices she had made out of love. And they would tell him about Mick, the dog who had stood by his side on that stormy night, refusing to leave until he was safe. For now, though, they were content to simply enjoy the peace that had come after the storm. Mick lay beside Charlie, who was now drifting off to sleep in his crib, his tiny fingers clutching Mick's fur even as his eyes grew heavy. It was a scene of perfect trust and love, a testament to the bond that had brought them all together. And as the night deepened, Clark and Hannah knew that Mick would remain where he always had been, by Charlie's side, watching over him with a love as steadfast and unyielding as the stars in the sky. As the years passed, Mick's legacy of loyalty continued to be woven into the fabric of Clark and Hannah's lives. Charlie grew up with Mick by his side, the two inseparable in their daily routines and adventures. From Charlie's first steps to his early school days, Mick was there, his steady presence a constant source of comfort and protection. The family marveled at the bond between the boy and his dog, a bond that seemed almost destined, rooted in a deep, unspoken understanding. Clark and Hannah often shared Linda's story with Charlie, teaching him about the resilience of his mother and the extraordinary loyalty of Mick. They told him about the night Mick had stood guard over him in the storm, refusing to leave until help arrived, and how his mother's final wish had been for him to have a family and be loved. Charlie listened with wide eyes, his small hand resting on Mick's back as if he, too, understood the gravity of their story. One rainy afternoon, while sitting by the window, Charlie asked Clark, "Dad, do you think Mick knows he's my hero?" Clark smiled, feeling a pang of emotion as he looked at Mick, whose muzzle had begun to show signs of graying with age. "I think he does, Charlie. Mick knew you were special from the beginning. He's always understood his job was to protect you, and he's never once forgotten it." As Charlie grew older, Mick's devotion only seemed to deepen. He walked beside Charlie to school, trotting happily by his side, his tail wagging as they made their way through the neighborhood. Everyone knew them by sight, the boy with the kind smile and the loyal dog at his heels. Mick became a local icon, respected by the entire community for his loyalty and bravery. People would stop to greet him, petting his head and murmuring words of gratitude and admiration. But as time passed, the signs of Mick's age became more pronounced. He slowed down, his steps less energetic than before, his eyes clouding slightly with the soft haze of old age. Clark and Hannah noticed the change, their hearts heavy as they watched Mick struggle to keep up with Charlie, though his spirit remained unbroken. Mick would still curl up beside Charlie's bed each night, his body growing frail but his gaze as sharp and protective as ever. One evening, when Charlie was around 10, he climbed into bed, pulling Mick close. He looked into the dog's tired eyes, sensing that his friend was beginning to grow weary. "Mick, I promise I'll always remember you," Charlie whispered, his voice filled with the fierce loyalty Mick had taught him. "You'll always be my hero." Mick leaned into Charlie's touch, his eyes softening as he let out a quiet sigh, resting his head on the boy's lap. There was a peace in his gaze, a deep satisfaction in knowing he had fulfilled his purpose. Mick had kept the promise he'd made to Linda, and Charlie was safe, surrounded by love and family. For a few moments, boy and dog sat together in perfect silence, the bond between them deeper than words. Over the next few weeks, Mick's health continued to decline. The family knew the time was near, and they did everything to keep him comfortable, showing him the love and appreciation he had earned many times over. On one particularly quiet afternoon, as the sun cast a warm glow through the windows, Mick lay by Charlie's side, his breathing slow and steady. Clark and Hannah sat with them, watching the two together, feeling both the sorrow of impending loss and the gratitude of a life well lived. Clark knelt down beside Mick, gently petting his head. "Thank you, Mick," he whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for everything you've done for us." With one last, loving look at his family, Mick closed his eyes, his loyal heart finally at rest. The room was silent, the weight of the moment filling the air as they said their goodbyes to the dog who had given them so much more than they could ever repay. In the days that followed, the family mourned Mick's loss, feeling the absence of his gentle spirit in their home. Yet, in their grief, they found comfort in the memories they shared, the countless moments he had been there for them, always watching, always protecting. For Charlie, Mick's absence was deeply felt, but he knew that his friend's legacy would live on in every memory, every lesson he'd learned about loyalty, bravery, and love. As Charlie grew, he carried Mick's story with him, sharing it with friends and neighbors, keeping alive the legacy of his loyal companion. He often revisited the tale of how Mick had watched over him on that stormy night, standing as a lone guardian until help arrived. People in the community spoke of Mick as a symbol of loyalty, a reminder of the strength of unconditional love. Whenever Charlie walked through the neighborhood, now a young man, people would smile and nod, recalling the dog who had once been his fierce protector. One evening, after graduating from school, Charlie found himself sitting by the window, watching the rain pour down. He thought of his mother, of the hardships she had endured, and of Mick, who had carried her final wish forward with such devotion. He made a silent promise to honor their memory by living with the same courage and compassion they had shown him. Years later, when Charlie had a family of his own, he adopted a dog, a gentle, dark-furred creature that reminded him of Mick in so many ways. He told his children the story of Mick, sharing the legacy of the dog who had loved him so fiercely. As they listened with wide eyes, captivated by the tale, Charlie felt the familiar warmth of Mick's spirit beside him, a guardian whose memory would remain part of their family forever. Mick's story lived on, a testament to the power of loyalty and love. He had been more than a dog, he had been a protector, a friend, and a hero to a little boy who needed him most. And as long as the story was told, Mick's legacy would continue, woven into the hearts of those who remembered him, inspiring acts of kindness and courage for generations to come.